Hello, Dick Wilkins here. Well, not a classic camera, but a classic camera shutter today. I wanted a telephoto lens and I didn't take much notice, but it actually came with a compound shutter, which I knew nothing about, but apparently they're quite common, especially on older large format cameras of number 3, number 4, number 5 shutter. So that's what I ended up with, and today I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to understand how it worked and also how to maintain it. There's a few things that you can do. There it is on the left. It's fairly bulky. It's about almost a kilogram. Its big brother, Tele Orton, is over a kilogram. Snyder Keimbach produced both these lenses, and although the later ones were often on a copal shutter, the early ones were invariably in a compound shutter, as we see on the left. Speaking of the different compound lenses, the early ones were more basic, but basically the same principle, but they were developed and fine-tuned over the years. Mine is about 1945. This one is around 1960s, 1970. Very little changes since 1945. The earlier ones were, as I said, more basic. They came up to a number 5 shutter, and they were pretty reliable as long as they're being maintained and treated well, not damaged. Ansel Adams commented they were reliable, but basic. And here is a small lens on one of his cameras with a compound shutter. There were different sizes. Some lenses were quite small, others very large in number 5 shutter. The top speed is only about 1/100th of a second. And it's probably better if you can get one that's still in the original lens board, etc., etc. If they're fiddled around with, it might be hard to make sure they're properly put together. Very early ones are probably worth avoiding, unless you can be sure they're working okay. They may not have a PC flash connector, which I wanted. If they're damaged, they can be quite difficult to repair, especially if the early ones had paper irises, and if they've been damaged by forcing different controls not in the right position. If there's no damage, probably all that needs maintaining is making sure the air piston works properly in any things like rust on the shutter blades, etc., just common repairs. You do have to move the front cover to do this. Another common fault is a broken off cable release. I'll show you how you can fix this. So here's the camera with the front of it. You have to do this if you have a large lens. So early models were more primitive. Even in the 1930s, they were quite different from 1940s. Note there's no flash connector on the one on the right. There are 3 unconventional features on a compound shutter. You can see the M, B and T positions at the bottom. In the M position, the shutter is in the conventional state, i.e. cocked and released with the 2 levers. The B and T functions are operated purely by using the shutter release. The cocking lever must not be used, otherwise the shutter will be damaged. At the top, the dial sets the shutter speed extreme clockwise, 1/100th of a second, extreme anti-clockwise, 1 second. The factory markings are on the edge of the dial. My markings in white showed what I got. We'll talk about that again later. The third feature that I should just mention is a little adjusting screw which gives some small adjustment to these speeds. To adjust the speed of the shutter, you turn the little dial at the top. It's not necessarily as accurate as you would like. I'll put on my speeds. And when you take this off, you can see there's a brass disc that as you turn, allows a spigot that's connected to the air cylinder to move a different amount. This controls the speed. It's a fairly crude thing. You can see on the left-hand side, when it's set to 1 second, the spigot can move quite a long way. In fact, it moves the full distance, not quite getting to the brass. So that's the 1 second. For faster speeds, when you turn it around, the spigot only has to move a very small distance, and the piston and the spring that makes it speed up only goes a very short distance. So here we have it on 1 second. We cock it, spigot moves right across. The shutter is released and it moves across roughly a second. Here it is on a faster speed. The brass disc moved a bit when I did this. Spigot only has to move a very short distance. Bang, the shutter is shut. Very simple, but not easily adjusted. So when it comes to pulling them apart, even a small amount, it's worth looking at a couple of websites. Here are two. In the second one, there's no sound, but a very good demonstration of how to clean the air piston. In my shutter, here is the front taken off. And you can see the basic, simple mechanisms that are involved. There's a strong spring that helps control the rate the shutter moves. And there's a tiny adjustment screw at the top, which allows you to have a bit of a calibration of the timing. Not a great deal. And here's the back plate and some of the levers that go into the air piston. And if we look at the back of the shutter body, we find the iris or diaphragm blades. These are steel, probably worth leaving alone if they're in reasonable condition. And here's actual shutter blades. There's 5 on my shutter. The earlier one that I showed you previously from the 1930s only has 3. I don't think you can get less than 3 blades and have the thing working. How does a compound shutter work? Well, when it is cocked, the red arrows indicate what moves where. When the shutter is released, a powerful spring under it turns it rapidly anti-clockwise. First, a lever opening the shutter, and if there's nothing in the way, it would rapidly turn back to the resting position, closing the shutter. This would take about 1/100th of a second. If the notched plate is in the way, it has to push against this. And depending on how far the notch plate is over, this could take anything from a second to a fraction of a second. we sort of can indicate what happens to the piston. It's set, released at the 1 second position, and at the 100th position, it's very rapidly released. There you can see it. We can depict this by slowing a shutter up about 8-fold and showing at 1 second how the piston moves across and the shutter shuts. When we go to 100th of a second, we can't really see things happening. So how does the piston work? Well, when you look at these photos, you can see there's a lever that goes up into the piston and controls the cylinder, and a spring tends to control the speed a bit. But the main thing that controls the speed is the pressure build-up on one side of the piston and the vacuum on the other. You can see the piston in the right-hand picture. If it's dirty, it doesn't work properly. But you mustn't put oil on it. It's just meant to be a metal fit that slowly lets air past it. If you put oil on it, it'll gum it up. The end caps are shown. They have to seal tightly against the cylinder, and they can give problems. In fact, they probably all will give problems if they haven't had the seals replaced. Often in the earlier ones, it was just a piece of cardboard which is worn thin and lets air leak in. So the cylinder doesn't move properly or consistently. An important point to note is that when the shutter is cocked, there's an initial build-up of pressure and vacuum in the cylinder, which must be given time to be released. Otherwise, the timings will be inaccurate. This is especially true at 1 second, and is recommended that about 10 seconds is given for this to happen. Otherwise, you'll have shorter shutter times. To replace or fix the seals in the end, I took a piece of silicon, thin silicon, out of the top of the crown seal and pushed it into the end caps. You have to tighten the end caps fairly well to make sure they are sealed. A word of warning: it's possible to take the end caps off while the shutter's whole, but I don't recommend this. You could snap the brass screws that hold it in place, as I did and others have done. Once you've sealed the caps, you should have a reliable, but perhaps not accurate, set of shutter speeds. What do I mean by reliable? Well, when I got the shutter, the speeds were completely unreliable. 1 second took 10 seconds, sometimes more or less. Half a second was several seconds, and quite variable. After I cleaned it, the speeds became reliable, but not accurate according to the dial. I used an iPhone shutter speed app, and here you can see the speeds I got. I could live with these, but they were generally a third or so slower than what the dial indicated. I put my markings on the outside, and these are quite reliable day in and day out. What can you do to adjust the speeds? Very little. The screw did nothing in my case. What I did find was by cleaning the helical spring under the cocking lever, it did increase the speed somewhat for 1 second. So I actually was getting 1 second. The other thing you can look at, but probably don't want to touch, is the little cam brass disc, which seems to be very crudely filed I don't recommend trying to change this. Okay, what else needs fixing? There was no cable socket on my shutter. These break off very easily. I simply glued on an old one from a Lubitol shutter. This works fine. I guess if you wanted cosmetically to fix it, you paint a bit of black around it. I didn't bother. The lens is in very good condition. I've mounted it in a speed graphic, and with the compound shutter I get very good results, both for landscape and for portraits using a strobe. A little fiddly with the speed graphic, but it works well. So there's a fairly long-winded expose on the compound shutter. I hope you get something useful out of it. Thank you.